Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance Podcast with Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley. We're sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights. I'm Mary Shirley, and today we're here to continue the Black Lives Matter conversation that Lisa, my co-host and partner in compliance, so ably initiated earlier in 2020. So going back into last year now, and the reason why we're doing this is that we didn't want Black Lives Matter to be a moment. We wanted to do our part to continue the conversation and contribute to efforts to make this a movement that lasts and forever changes the course of history. To further the discussion, we are very pleased to have Sisieta Owen from Bloomberg as our guest today. Sisieta, welcome. Will you tell us about yourself?
Oh, hi, Mary. Firstly, I'd like to say a very big thank you for having me on your show. I do really feel honoured, to be part of the podcast today. And I do sincerely think that yourself and Lisa are doing a great job across the industry. So thank you for that. About myself, now I normally do this in two slants. So professionally, I am a regulatory compliance advisor. A regulatory compliance officer at Bloomberg. I lead a global monitoring and testing program across the APAC, EMEA, and Americas regions. And I've been at Bloomberg now for about over 4 years, coming up to 5 in March next year. Personally, I'm a Nigerian origin. I was born in London, but migrated back to Nigeria with parents and alongside 5 other siblings to spend my early years in Nigeria and attended a boarding secondary school, and then came straight back after secondary school to the UK to continue A-levels, university, and started working. So a real mix of culture there in terms of experience, which has really enabled me to broaden my landscape. Mm-hmm. And also I'm married and a mom of 2 hyperactive boys, a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old. And they both, keep me on my toes, keep me thinking ahead. And then I do have a really, really deep passion for inclusion and integrity. And I think for me, that's almost fulfilling a purpose and aligns so well with my role in compliance that, it's even become more of a driving force for me.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that. And interesting to hear from you the perspective from the UK. What was the reaction to Black Lives Matter in the UK? Right. Okay.
So I think Black Lives Matter as a movement, there were several of them, but I think one of the key attributes of Black Lives Matter is helping globalize an issue that would have otherwise just been seen as an American, maybe a typical American matter or problem. And in the process of that globalization, where, the UK was able to translate and apply to the landscape, came reflection, and out of that came the other emotions. So, we saw a lot of vulnerabilities. It drove ownership, accountability, conviction, all the positive things that you need to actually shift and start to go towards change. There was boldness that came with that as well. So don't get me wrong, those were the positive things. There was some obviously negative emotions attached to those things. So we saw the anger, we saw outbursts, we saw despair, we saw the resulting riots and the protests, across different parts of the country. But effectively what that brought about was a reflection, accountability, the real education piece and awareness came with that as well. So there was a mixed array of emotions and outcomes from that.
And what has been pleasing to you in terms of progress made on the movement? Where do you think the biggest opportunities are for improvement still? So what are the positives and where do we still have to make an effort?
Yeah, I think the biggest movement for me, or the biggest move towards positive, is within the awareness it's created. So it's created such there's so much educational pieces has come with it that ignorance is no longer an excuse or can no longer be an excuse. Mm-hmm. So it's both a willingness to learn and an unwillingness to learn as well. So whether you're willing or unwilling, it's almost forced that educational piece forward, whereby, the continuous hiding behind ignorance is really not acceptable and no longer an excuse. So for me, that's been the most, I would say, positive outcome of it all. Where I feel that we still have some work to do, and this is going to be ongoing. It's not something, that I ever feel or ever see can be fixed in one go, because it's a very complex area and it can be very subjective. But the couple of areas that I can wholly say where we still require significant work is in the area of practicality. So, we've gone through the educational piece. People are now very aware, whether they wanted to be or coerced or forced into being aware. But it's almost like, what are we supposed to do is still the questions that are coming through. It's still a grey area how we apply, the practicality. We've talked about allyship in the educational piece. We've given examples of how to be a good ally. We've talked about privilege, but still there's a piece that needs to break it down even further in terms of how practically this can be embedded in day-to-day living. Because that's where we're going to actually beginning to see fruition, right? Where we start to be able to implement this in our day-to-day interactions. And I think that's the piece that we still need to work on. And as well, from a sort of a firm perspective, firm-wide perspective, data. So without data, it's difficult to drive real tangible changes. Okay, so it's the tapes that are put around data. How do we collect data? Where do we get the data from? The credibility of the data. Can the data be published or not because we've not hit certain thresholds? All of that, it needs to, we got a lot of work in either saying, okay, well, this gives reasons to actually, just use what we have and circumvent all the sort of tapes and parameters that are put around handling of data. Or we start to push a huge campaign on how we can get that data in the shape and form that we need it to be, where we can publicly consume it and use it to actually drive change. So those are the two sort of broad areas I feel we can potentially still need some more work and digging on.
And it's a wonderful segue into our next line of questioning on some of the actions that we can take. But before we do, I just wanted to comment. I think you made a really astute observation that I hadn't, consciously thought about before, which is that now unwillingness is no longer an option. And I think that's a really key aspect that we've come to such a boiling point. That standing by or walking on by is no longer permissible or something that you can choose to do very easily. So I thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah.
So you've given a lot of consideration to what companies can do to move from reflection and guilt to tangible actions of demonstrable allyship, which I think touches very nicely on what you mentioned as an area for improvement. What is your advice for moving the dial in this area?
I think to move the dial, there's one key consideration that we have to make or be aware of, that in terms of giving flexibility as well and making sure that, we get sort of the buy-ins and the traction that's required, is knowing that everyone is at a different stage and a different level of their understanding in their journey, and their willingness to, or acceptance of what is or what isn't. So it's understanding what stages everyone is at, whether it's an individual, a firm, a department, or a company, having that understanding, then curating call to actions, because, I think everyone has had a fair chunk of like material thrown at them. A lot of social awareness, everything is in the news, is in the media. There are tons and tons. You go to work, it's been discussed. There's training sessions being rolled out. At the back of all of that is I'm saying, okay, for where we are now as a department, as an individual, as a business, what are the call to actions that we could actually act on and implement, and what timelines, what are the milestones we want to achieve? And I think that's the first, because that's how you start to build accountability and ownership. And I think when we get to that point where we think we can start putting those call to actions in place and coming back and reviewing, what success means, what metrics we've derived from that, or creating metrics around that, then that is really where I think we're moving the dial forward, because we're going now beyond the reflection, we're going now beyond the education and the awareness. We're actually saying, okay, I've consumed all of this. This is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it, and this is when we want to achieve this. And I think that's how we'll start to move the dial.
So if I reiterate, essentially what you're suggesting is that you almost want to have a project plan for a campaign of sorts, right? So it's setting out what your goals are. It's setting out your project milestones for when you want to achieve certain things by, and it's discussing how you're going to take certain approaches.
Yeah. So an example would be something as simple as, okay, we want to equip, for example, we want to, speaking hypothetically, we want to equip our senior leaders or managers with the skill set to be an inclusive leader. That's an example. Well, how do we do that? What does inclusive leadership actually mean? So we get that defined based on, what the workforce looks like, what the employee strata looks like. And then once we've got that definition, then we'll start to put the sort of implement the actions that we need to do in order to achieve inclusive leadership. Is that training? Is that theoretical training? Is there a way that we can actually get some real insight into, the diverse population that we're looking to build upon or that we have in our organization? For example, peer-to-peer mentoring. Can we get our senior leaders mentored by peers in the industry who are of a BAME background or who are of a Black background, for example? And that way it takes away some of the pressure of being in the same firm. It kind of starts to forge that relationship and that network and that real understanding, and makes it less formal. And that's a more practical way and allows that safe space to ask questions and just be a bit more authentic about that relationship, as opposed to, in-house mentoring programs that you will have, which could be slightly formal and have some sort of, barrier issues to it.
That's a great example. Thank you for doing that to help illustrate what it might look like. At Bloomberg, you've been involved in various intervention forums, discussions, and working groups on this exact subject matter. What success stories can you share with us on initiatives implemented and/or actions taken?
So I'll say one of the very key ones for me is the focus and the transparency that's been created around race. And this was a very swift response to all the occurrences, and I would say probably the Black Lives movement, the Black Lives Matter movement as well. We've had a series of race conversations, actually starting from senior management, starting from the management committee down the chain, to the point where what we're trying to achieve is be comfortable being uncomfortable. So like I alluded to earlier on, ignorance is no longer an excuse. Saying I don't want to offend anyone is no longer an excuse. Actually, we've opened the ground up to say it's okay, be vulnerable, be uncomfortable, but we have to have these conversations. We have to forge ahead. So that's the one, because it's the only time. We've always talked about diversity. We talk about different strands of diversity, but we've never actually focused on race in the way in which I've seen it this year, across all levels. So I think that's been a real outcome. And of course, on the back of that, we've had the dialogue, we've had designated race related matters forums, actually headed by most senior leaders in the organization really focusing on what strategies can be put in place, looking across where the inherent barriers, within the organization that are affecting our Black population. How can we progress our Black population? How can we create representation? How do we make sure that we're not being biased in our selective process or in our recruitment process? So all of that has been happening through designated forums and various sort of initiatives to recruit, retain, and promote BAME and Black individuals within the firm as well. And I think it's all really positive change, which is sort of gathered very quick momentum. And to your point earlier on, the one thing we now want to do is keep that going, right? So we want to keep the momentum going, turn it into real success stories, actions, and, keep that drive going so we don't go backwards.
And so do you anticipate that these focus groups and discussion groups will continue throughout 2021?
Yeah, because I think what we've realized is there are issues that need to be solved for, that can be solved for immediately, and hence almost putting a project plan and a timeline in place. So going in is we've identified some key areas. For example, one of the key, and it's not unique to Bloomberg, I think is unique across to every sort of big organization, is the representation, right? So it's a lack of representation. When you look upwards in middle management, senior management, who are your decision makers? What's the makeup of, your cohort, your decision making cohort? So that's a wider and a broader conversation, which is something that can be solved imminently. But we can put pillars and plans in place and begin to work towards tweaking that a little bit and getting that balance right. And
speaking about keeping the momentum going, how can we as society hold companies accountable to their initial social media pledges? You were talking a lot about how this was in the news earlier on, and there was a lot of conversation at the beginning. And one of the things that I noticed was that whenever I jumped on Facebook, there would be a new statement made by a retail company about the importance of anti-racism and affirming that Black Lives Matter. So how can we hold companies accountable to these initial social media pledges, and how can we keep the momentum going after the initial implosion?
I think, I don't know, but I think it's one of a simple fix. There are two ways to do that. Initially, in terms of accountability and ownership, I would probably say the owners of those platforms, so the like of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, can actually reach out to these firms and say, hey, can we talk to you about, the sort of posts that you made on such and such time or such and such week. We just want to know how far, how you're getting on, to see if we can use that and share it. It will be a good success story. That's one way of checking in. And again, is almost sending a message back to say it's not a tick box exercise, and it's not a case to showcase who can make the best statements. It's actually, putting your money where your mouth is. If you say you're going to do it, then do it and mean it from the heart. The other way of doing that is actually seeking out firms and organizations and individuals that have actually gone ahead and done exactly what they say they're going to do, or, actually doing good things and celebrating those individuals on the same platform as well. So I think that's an initial 2 steps that can be taken to start to reel in and check in on, how we're doing going forward.
Great ideas. Thank you. In compliance, we're very big fans of KPIs and assessing whether our compliance program is in fact effective, which leads me to my next question of how can companies assess whether they've done a good job based on their efforts of commitment to diversity, equality and inclusion?
Okay. It's funny that you mentioned in compliance, we're very good at metrics, because I was listening to that question, and what I picked up initially were the 3 things that you mentioned, which to me started ringing KPIs. So you've got diversity, you've got equity, and you've got inclusion. In terms of diversity, I will say, okay, just take a broad look at your representation of the firm. How are you doing across the different levels? what's your ratio across the different levels, and that gives you your diversity matrix, right? That tells you how well you're doing. When you look at inclusion, that's more of a subjective way of assessment, but then you can easily tell, what's the allyship going on within the organization, how you seeing the partnering, the collaboration, what collaboration is happening between colleagues in the department of different races. Do you actually get a genuine, as a leader, do you get over teams? So as a leader myself, of global teams or of diverse backgrounds, I have a sense of which individual within my team is feeling very comfortable and being very authentic when they come into work. Now, I'm not sure, I wouldn't say that's probably because of my, my background of being of a diverse background myself, but I think every leader probably has a sense of how comfortable the team members are. And then if you know that, and there's someone on your team who isn't as comfortable as being themselves or authentic, maybe they come to work and they've got a work persona that they put on, maybe it's finding the subtle ways. How do you start to address that? Because, we only perform our best when we can be our full self at work. That's a measure of inclusion. So, if you look at across every team and challenge every team leader or manager or senior leader to say within your teams, how authentic is your team? How comfortable are your team members being themselves at work?
That leads me to a job title or a role that I saw advertised several months ago, and I think it was Alexion Pharmaceuticals, and they had a role called Head of Belonging, which I thought was very cool, and it's that extra step. So we've heard about inclusion being asked to dance, the equivalent of that, and belonging is being able to dance like nobody's watching. So I think that hits home. So when people are allowed to be their authentic selves, we take a step beyond being included and we have belonging, which I think is the goal that we should all be striving for, is however long it takes, let's get to the point where everyone feels like the workplace, society generally, is a place that they can belong and feel free to be whoever they want to be.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And it's a difficult one, I must say, to put a metrics around that. It's difficult, but there are ways that you can gauge it in the ways of sort of measuring, how each individual is interacting, and you will have to really have a reliance on the team managers or the team leaders for that aspect, because and this is where again it comes back to a manager is fully equipped to manage individuals of various diverse backgrounds. And that's where the training points come in.
Yeah, one thing that we could consider, I think, is including a question in our culture of integrity surveys as simple as, do you feel like you belong in our, office / workplace / community / whatever it is, and measure on the responses to that. I think that would be a really interesting question to start asking in amongst the, the very typical compliance questions of, do you feel like it is safe to speak up, blah, blah, blah.
That's right.
And then do you have a sense of belonging in our workplace?
The other thing is, because we look at inclusion and we look at diversity, okay, we're looking at it from a race angle, but also, within the socio-economic sort of classification of strata, because something that we've started doing most recently, and we're still trying to push out the campaign on the self-ID, is we've added a strand on socio-economic status as well, and trying to put some questioning around that, because that goes to your point where you talked about dancing like no one is watching and feeling like you belong, because if you suddenly find yourself in an environment where everyone has been private school or independent school educated up to a certain level, and you haven't, and you're beginning to feel, oh, okay, do I actually belong here? And that could probably come out in, so with that data around the socioeconomic status of employees, you can better understand the landscape of the organization. And that then drives the plan that you put in place, or what initiatives you're putting in place to make sure you're creating a real inclusive workforce.
So I always feel like examples are fantastic for our listeners to have takeaways. And so I'd love to ask you, what is an inclusivity initiative that you've implemented or heard of another organization implementing that you think will really make a difference?
One of them I think I've talked about already, which is a peer-to-peer mentoring, which is a way of just providing some real practical insights, without the red tape around it, without the barriers, forging that real relationship and network. The other one, which we've actually done, and I know of other firms and banks that are beginning to go on board with it, is the BAME, the grouping of the BAME networks, splitting it out, because there's the complications in actually grouping it together as BAME. So, calling it out as in the different ethnic groups and actually understanding the attributes of the different ethnic groups and addressing those attributes differently and creating the initiatives to go with that has been one element to response that I've seen firms take. And we've actually we've been doing that a while at Bloomberg. So at Bloomberg, we've got the Black professional community as opposed to a BAME community. However, what we've done is we've also got, every ethnic group has got its strand of its represented in the community. And it goes back to, understanding the landscape of your employee workforce or your workforce, and then create initiatives that make sure that you're including everyone and you're covering the entire landscape. And that's the stance that we've taken. And I think I see a lot of firms beginning to take that and move away from grouping of BAME and looking at breaking it down to really get to the bottom and understand the challenges and hurdles faced by each community. The other thing is reverse mentoring. Now, not reverse mentoring in the sense, in the traditional sense of knowing, where you got the senior leaders versus, the more junior employee and, want to share skill set. This is really looking at the junior population, so the new entrants into the firm. Just to make sure, because that's where, if you're going to get, attrition, that's where it happens, new entrants coming into the firm before the 2-year mark, finding it very hostile, can't cope, finding it difficult to navigate the culture there. How do they get nurtured and who nurtures them? And in return, we're not looking at senior managers to actually be the mentees. We're looking at those very middle or new TLs as well, team leaders, who can also start to learn and use it as a training platform to understand the attributes of diverse employees that are coming into the firm and some of the challenges that they face. So in a way, it's almost an exchange of experience, and both sides are actually gaining a way of training. So the new entrant, the new employee is gaining from the team leader expertise needed to sort of, navigate a firm, a big firm like Bloomberg. And also the team leader is able to gain experience and some understanding of that would help be a better team leader and how to best manage, new entrants and nurture those new entrants so we don't get those attrition in that time period.
Fantastic. Thank you for those examples, and thank you so much for spending some time with us today. I felt like we had a really productive conversation, and I'm so grateful for your time and your thoughts and your energy.
Thank you, Mary. It's been a pleasure.
Same here. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in to contribute to continuance of the dialogue on this critical topic and in helping to ensure that it's not just a fleeting moment on societal conscience. Be well and take care of each other.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.